Hi, physiology class. Thanks for doing your homework. So there's a lot of different receptors we're going to study in this unit. We have chemoreceptors, which respond to changes in chemical concentrations. Those would be like oxygen receptors, carbon dioxide receptors, hydrogen ion for pH. There's pain receptors. They typically respond to chemicals released during tissue damage. Thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. Mechanoreceptors are responding to mechanical forces, like when we touch something. And then our photoreceptors respond to light. And those are only located in our eyes. And actually, I should take that back, also in our pineal gland. So these sensory impulses are traveling on sensory neurons. So just to review what we learned from Unit 1, these sensory neurons have specialized dendrite receptors that are stimulated, which causes local changes in the neuron's membrane potential. Then we create an electrical current in the dendrite end, and if the current is strong enough, we can reach threshold at the axon, and then that axon will trigger an action potential series that travels all the way down the axon, and it would end up with us having a sensation. So a sensation is a feeling that occurs when our brain interprets that sensory impulse. Sensations all look the same en route to the brain. They're just nerve impulses, action potential waves traveling along nerve fibers. So it's not until the brain that we actually interpret what that sensation is. So it all depends on where the impulse ends up in the brain. So if that sensation travels from the body and ends up here, then I'm going to feel it in the trunk. If it's traveling through my body and it ends up in this part of the brain, then I'm going to feel it in my foot. So where the impulse ends up ultimately determines what type of sensation we interpret. Our skin is very sensitive to touch. There's a lot of different mechanoreceptors embedded within our skin, and we're going to look at a few of them. There's sensory receptors. We also are calling those guys free nerve endings, and they specialize in very light touch and pressure. Meissner's corpuscles we find in our hairless skin, like our fingertips, lips, and palms, and they're also for light touch, but maybe a little bit stronger of a mechanical stimulus to get those guys triggered. And then deeper in our skin are our Pacinian corpuscles. And they can even be as far down as our tendons and our muscles. So they're going to sense deep pressure, and they're located deeper within our skin tissues. So in the graphic here, we can see our free nerve endings right there. And they're just below the epidermis. So they're really close to the surface of the skin, really. So they're specializing again in light touch. We have a specialized receptor over here, Meissner's corpuscle, with a special tip or receptive end, and that also does light touch. And then down here deeper, we have our Pacinian corpuscle. So interestingly, this layering you see here, it kind of looks like an onion. So to get these Pacinian corpuscles to be stimulated, we have to push through all of these layers till we finally get down to the tip of the neuron here to get it to fire off. So that ensures that a light touch can't get these guys to fire. So they have this special ending which actually makes sure that only deep pressure stimulates them, not a light touch. So we also have a lot of thermoreceptors for temperature embedded in our skin, and these are free nerve endings, no special tip on them. We have heat receptors, which respond typically between the range of 77 degrees to 113 degrees Fahrenheit. And then our cold receptors, which fire off somewhere between 50 to 68. And then in between that 68 and to 77, maybe they'll both fire. You'll get some hot ones firing, some cold ones firing, so there's some overlap there. When we do go above the 113 or below the 50, then we're also going to trigger pain receptors at the same time. So we'll get hot when it's 115 degrees and pain. So a burning sensation is going to start to develop there. Our temperature sensors adapt very quickly, and we're going to talk more about adaptation in a second. But you know when you get into a really hot jacuzzi, and when you get in it's kind of uncomfortable, it's too hot, and then you're just in there for, a minute, 2 minutes, and it already starts to feel like it's cooled. And the water's not cooling down. It's got a thermoregulator on it, so make sure that the temperature stays at 104 degrees in there, but your body doesn't feel like it's as hot because you're adapting to it. So let's talk about adaptation. Adaptation occurs as sensors adapt to a stimulus. So over time, when a stimulus has been constant, those neurons become less responsive to that stimulus. So they'll start to send fewer and fewer action potentials, and eventually they may stop sending an impulse altogether. So once a neuron has adapted, it won't tend to send a new signal again until the stimulus has changed. So it's either gotten stronger, it's gotten weaker, but it's not the same strength of a stimulus anymore. Something is different. And there's an evolutionary reason to do that. Your brain is dealing with hundreds of thousands of sensations it has to interpret and make sense of all of the time. So if the information coming, to the brain isn't any different, then why keep telling the brain that information? We're trying to save it some extra work that it doesn't really need to be doing. So an example of that would be when you put your clothes on in the morning and maybe your sweater feels a little bit too tight on your arms, and after 30 seconds, you don't really feel it anymore. Your brain has gotten the information. It's not any different. It's not dangerous that sweater is tight, so there's really no reason for the brain to keep hearing, the sweater's too tight on your arm, the sweater's too tight on your arm, the sweater's too tight on your arm. So we just turn it off, basically. We have some other mechanoreceptors embedded in our tissues. They're called proprioceptors. And these sensors are typically located in our muscles and tendons and inside of a joint, and they respond to mechanical movements. And this is how we know when our parts move. So in this picture here, these red stringy fibers right here and here are muscle fibers. And so we've got our proprioceptor right here tangled around those muscle fibers. So when that muscle contracts, which is going to change its size, those stretch receptors or proprioceptors are going to be stimulated. The impulse is going to go to the brain, and the brain's going to get a message that that muscle is moving. So I'm going to know that muscle's working, doing something. And over here on this side, I have a proprioceptor, and this one is located on the tendon instead of embedded in the muscle. So if that tendon gets stretched, which would happen when the muscle contracts, then I'm also going to know that that muscle is moving. Pain. Ouch. Pain neurons are free nerve endings. They're everywhere in our skin and our internal tissues, but they are not in our brain. So that means a neurosurgeon can inject you with a little anesthetic on your skin, cut into your skull, and be operating on your brain while you are wide awake and you would not feel a thing. In fact, that's the way neurosurgeons like to do their brain surgeries. They want to be talking to you while they're cutting and lasering, so they can ask you questions. What are you feeling? Can you repeat this? Can you think? While they're doing their work, and then they know if if they're doing any brain damage. The purpose for pain is to help protect us against tissue damage. So it's an important message, and when we're in pain, we need to pay attention to that message. In fact, there's some people that don't have any pain sensation, and they're constantly hurting themselves and doing some, serious damage to themselves because they can't sense pain. Because it's such an important sensation, it's telling us something is wrong in our body, it doesn't adapt very well. If it did, you know what we would do. So if I broke my arm, I'm registering pain like 10 out of 1 out of 10. if that pain started to decrease, went to an 8 and then to 6 and then a 4, maybe a 2, then I would kind of just let my dangling broken little arm with my bones sticking out, I'd just leave it alone until it was convenient for me to go to the doctor. I wouldn't go take care of it right away like it was an emergency. I'd, schedule an appointment in a couple days when I was less busy. So pain does not adapt very well, and for good reason. So when we injure a tissue, we're damaging cells. The guts of the cells usually spill out of that damaged cell, and those chemicals are the stimulant for those pain receptors. So the guts of cells or chemicals released by damaged cells are what stimulate our pain receptors to fire. So some other things that can trigger pain are very low oxygen levels. So if our oxygen supply in our bloodstream, our cardiovascular system is low, then we may feel pain or experience pain. And sometimes that's the headache we feel at the end of a day when we're tired and our metabolism is slowed down and we're not moving oxygen so well. Sometimes the muscles in our forehead or our temples aren't getting enough oxygen, and that can trigger pain. Excessive stimulation of our mechanoreceptors, like our touch receptors that have been kind of pushed on for too long, can start to trigger pain sensation. And we do have some natural pain controls. We have enkephalins, which are released in our spinal cord and can stop or slow impulses at that point. We also have endorphins, which are released from our pituitary gland, and they can work a lot like morphine and slow or reduce pain impulses. So there are different types of pain in our body. Our organs or our viscera, which we call visceral pain, they don't respond to small tissue damage. So it usually has to be a widespread area for us to actually feel pain in an organ, like in our stomach or our intestines. So if you have just a little itty bitty ulcer going on in your stomach, you're not going to notice that at all. So when it's bigger, like quarter size, $50 size, then we're going to start to feel that pain. So our organs do not have very many pain receptors in them. So it takes a pretty big stimulus to get your organs to feel that damage. So they usually categorize pain as either acute or chronic. And acute pain is really sharp, intense, stabbing pain. It's typically letting us know that there's tissue damage that's occurring, and those impulses are traveling on thick myelinated fibers. So that means the impulse is getting to the brain fast. And it's typically a pain impulse that's going to stop when the tissue has repaired. And those types of acute pain usually are occurring in our skin. If you've ever had, road rash, you know how painful that little bit of tissue damage can be, but it's because it's all through the skin and we experience acute pain in our skin. Chronic pain is slower impulses. They come on thin, unmyelinated fibers, and it's usually a duller ache. And unfortunately, with chronic pain, sometimes the pain may continue even after the tissue damage has healed itself. So scientists have been figuring out that there's these loops that are set up in our brain, little circular loops of neurons that just keep constantly firing and causing each other to fire. So our brain, when it's experienced pain for a while, and typically, like we've talked before about lower back pain and how susceptible the back is to problems. So you've had this chronic pain in your back for months and months, and pretty soon the brain just sets up this little network of running loops that say pain, 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 pain. So even after your back is healed, that little loop in your brain still keeps going. So we've got to figure out a different way to stop that pain. Referred pain. This is pretty interesting. So we have different organs sharing a common nerve pathway to the brain. And remember, sensations are interpreted in the brain. So the most classic example of this that you've probably seen is when a person on TV the movies is having a heart attack, and instead of grabbing for their heart, where the tissue damage is actually occurring, they grab for their left arm. So as we can see here, so our heart is having tissue damage, so it sends a pain sensation up here. Well, that impulse is transferred to a second neuron, which also receives information from the skin. So now my impulse continues, and the thalamus routes it up into the sensory cortex to the skin area of the brain. And so my left arm sensation is experienced because I went to the wrong place in the sensory cortex. Instead of going to the heart part of the brain, I went to the left arm part of the brain, because there's one message and they all look the same. So this diagram just has a few other examples of referred pain. So I could have gallstones, so I'm feeling some inflammation in my gallbladder, which is located here. Whoops. Here. But because of referred pain, I go to the doctor complaining of pain in my, neck and shoulder on the right side. So pain impulses are going to be routed through the thalamus. So remember, as impulses travel up through the thalamus, we get this general awareness. So we would know there's pain occurring. And then it's going to route it into the sensory cortex. And we'll be able to judge the intensity of the pain, locate the source of the pain. Then it'll go into the cerebral cortex, and we'll probably produce some sort of a motor response to the pain, move our bodies in some way to get us out of pain if possible. We're going to go through the limbic system, and we're going to produce some emotions in response to that pain. I'm sure none of them are happy feelings about the pain. And then, if we're lucky, our body will start to generate some of our own natural pain-inhibiting substances, like the enkephalins and serotonin and endorphins, and they'll make the pain more manageable, so it's not so severe that we actually pass out and we can't function in a way that's going to help us survive in potentially dangerous situation. Protection is sort of this weird phenomenon that makes us feel like our fingers are doing the touching and our nose is doing the smelling and our ears are doing the hearing, when we know really the brain is doing all of that. So our brain somehow projects the sensation back to the source of the stimulus to make us feel like our fingers are doing the touching. It's kind of a weird phenomenon. We don't understand it completely, but that's what's happening.